wait till we get our recording notification. There we go. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dean Terry. I'm getting an echo there. Mute their mics. Thank you. All right. Welcome again. I'm Dean Terry, Associate Professor of Arts and Technology. And today we have the MFA Defense of Catalina Alzate, who I've had the honor of working with over the past few years, and I'm certainly miss her when she goes. I have to say that. I'm covering today for the chair of this committee, Dean Balsamo, who sends her regrets in not being able to attend. I know she'd be here if it were possible. We are recording this for her to view later. We have as Professor Juan Lopez Rodriguez, third member of the committee. Hello, Juan. He's here with us today. We have a set process for this defense. The structure is there's several sections. The first section is a 20-minute public presentation the candidate will make. And the second section is 20 minutes of questions and answers, including questions from the committee. This is also a public section, so please, there's just two of us on the committee today, so while you're watching the presentation, feel free to note down some questions for Catalina, and feel free to ask them. So we'll have 20 minutes for that. This section is moderated by the student, the candidate. And then third, we'll ask everyone to leave so the committee can deliberate for about 10 minutes. So after the Q&A section, there'll be a deliberation section where everyone else leaves. And then just so everyone knows, lastly, we invite the student back and the committee discusses with the students the examination. So with that, I think that's the layout. So Catalina, you are on for your presentation. If everyone would please mute their mics and cameras, that'd be great. Release their mics.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you, Dr. Llamas, for being here and for your guidance, and thank you everyone else for being in this space. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Yeah, and I hope. Yeah, I guess it's visible, and I'm going to time myself for the 20 minutes. Welcome to this presentation. The title of this project is Ecologies of Participation, Design Practices for Resignifying Territories. So even though I'm presenting, I think it's very important to acknowledge that this project wasn't possible without the participation of many people that, thanks to COVID, happen to be around the world. So I just want to acknowledge all the people who participated and were part of this project. I'll begin with a quick intro. I've been a practitioner of participatory design for a number of years, and after my journey in ATEC, I took the opportunity of this thesis project to question my design practice. By engaging with critical design theory and feminist theory, it became clear to me that the discipline of design has a historical debt in the perpetuation of inequality and environmental unsustainability. The linearity and standardization of design processes, the use of people as subjects of research, the focus on methods, contribute to leaving aside the complexity of social situations and are oriented towards solving something, many times without recognizing that people and communities solve their own issues. My sources to learn about these are Latin American design theorists and thinkers. In contrast to the global north, where the canons of designs have been developed, a lot of what happens in the South is the adaptation of design methods to local needs and the restructuring of such methods along feminist and indigenous struggles. Inspired by all this, I was convinced that we must do design differently, rethink our toolbox and ways of doing if we want to engage with the struggles in the real world. So the main component of this transformation for me is to intentionally break the linearity of design processes, many times fueled by the need to be productive. The focus of this thesis is to privilege process over product in design and to engage with emergence. Emergence cannot be design. Emergence is to be attuned with nature. And what I set up for myself here was to approach a design from a different perspective, as I have done it before, and allowing the process to show me the way forward. So here are some of the questions that I was asking at the beginning. As I was saying before, I was questioning my practice, or I wanted to unpack what are some of the meanings of participation of design beyond just bringing people together and calling it a participatory experience. How do technologies are part of these processes, and how do reflection processes are part of design processes? So one of the first ways in which I started questioning my practice was to looking carefully at the vocabulary that I use. This is going to come up at different parts of the project, but the first concept I started thinking on was the idea of manifestations. So what I set up for myself was to be thinking about these things and reading theory and getting inspired and allowing certain small projects to emerge. But I don't call them projects, I call them manifestations, and they are material explorations, they are experiments that manifest concepts, and they also manifest an intention. And more than providing answers, they kind of help me to ask questions. So this is a very imperfect map of my experience during the thesis. As I was saying before, I engaged in a number of processes. Walking, for example, was very useful for me to get clarity throughout this year. And these manifestations, these small projects started emerging, and they took the form of 3 workshops, 1 blog post, and a couple of publications that I had the opportunity to put forward. So what I'm going to do now is to describe to you the workshops and the questions and how all of these evolved over time. So the first workshop is titled The Underlying Paths of Participation, and this was in the framework of the Participatory Design Conference last year. The conference took place in my hometown in Colombia. However, because of COVID, participants were distributed across the world. And it was online, obviously. So the idea was originally to do an accordion book and been asking questions about the underlying parts of participation. That means kind of not necessarily what the project was, but what was the process that we as practitioners were going through. The workshop was in English and Spanish, and the idea was to create this accordion book with all these reflections. So what I did was to start the accordion book by myself. I started it as a way of communicating to participants what the workshop was about, and also as an invitation for them to create more pages for this book. So we were not trying to arrive at the definition of what participation is, but we were more trying to engage with the complexity of it. And I wanted it to be like messy and complex conversations. So I invited participants to follow a number of processes, including a reflection process in which they choose a particular experience, because this is not from theory, this is from our lived examples. And to look at the notion of mediation, especially to understand how technologies are part of participation, or how do technologies participate. I also invited them to look at certain words that are rarely present in the literature of this field, and think on how can they become part of our vocabulary to kind of change the logic that we are using for designing. They kind of completed some sentences, and we together talked about it. So as I said before, the workshop was last year, and it's also documented in a website. So here are some of the works of the participants. What was very interesting is that many of them worked on this by hand, and they had the pages of the book with them during the workshop. So we couldn't assemble it physically, but we assembled it as a digital publication. And in a way, it's kind of kind of poetic to think that this book has distributed pages around the world, but they are very rich in symbolism. One of the things that happened, and the idea of the workshop was also to think on experiences that come from the global south, because the literature on participatory design is mostly from Scandinavia. So we realized, for example, that many communities actually do participatory processes. So then we questioned, so what is our expertise as designers? Like, why are we entering a space and saying that we know how to do these processes when people are already engaged in these kind of encounters? So literally everyone had an accordion book, and now this became kind of a hot publication. We also used an online note-taking tool to build a roadmap of meanings that had like many directions and connections. And I'm not going to go into detail on this, and we learned about so many things. It was a full day workshop, so we held multiple conversations, but I just wanted to focus on a couple of learnings. So the first one is we are talking about reflection processes, and then we said, how can this become a tool for action? How is it that we can incorporate reflection processes during design when we are designing rather than as a retrospective kind of approach? We also were kind of bringing down this romanticized notion that participation is always positive and that everyone feels comfortable and feels safe in these spaces. And we spoke about what are the risks that we have faced during these kind of projects. We also talk about the role of institutions, because this is something that rarely comes in publications on the ways that we get to know about projects, but how are they actually shaping these processes, and what are the boundaries that they are setting up for these encounters? And lastly, we spoke about how many of these processes are very intuitive. Like, we all work from our heart, and it's a very kind of human-to-human kind of experience to do participatory processes. However, instinct and intuition are not like regarded as a methodology, right? So we spoke about like what if we frame it as a methodology? What will it need to be a valid form of knowledge production? So at this point, I recognized that what I was doing with this workshop and in general with my thinking was to resignify my intellectual, my professional, political territory in design. And I was bringing people together who occupy a similar territory to question it and to resignify it. So I became interested in this idea of territory, and I was thinking on maps because I wanted to have some sort of material substract in which to work and take forward these questions. Here's where the second workshop emerged. The title of this workshop is Beyond Cartography, Pandemic Ecologies. And what I was doing for this workshop was to invite the participants to rethink the territories that we occupy during the pandemic and think on ways in which we can map those spaces. So we began by expanding the notion of territories from our bodies to physical spaces and location, to our imaginaries and our intellect, and how these three are always interconnected. Two key concepts we were working with, there is a background for that, but two key concepts are occupation and deterritorialization. And I was proposing that we move from this, which is having a hand with the knowledge already in the head, and approaching the map as a space where you already know what you're going to map. And instead, I proposed the participants to dive into the map and to see the map as a space where we can land and can provide us with new knowledge instead of us providing the map with the knowledge. We had participants, again, all over the world, and these drawings were part of what helped me think through these concepts. So I was inspired by the work of Guattari and Deleuze on the liberation of cartography. They said that we liberate cartography when we let go of the need to be accurate, and we are able to map disorientation or the unconscious. So I said, how can this become a pedagogy to map territories with people? So we look at some examples. I just have 3 of them here, but we looked at multiple examples of the idea of mental cartographies, and I invited participants to engage with our creative energy. So that meant small body exercises, different prompts to allow us to feel the mutation of our energies. And I also invited them to detach from the need of rationality. So this is not the type of mapping that is looking for orientation, but indeed for a little bit of disorientation. So I said this before, we were taking the pandemic as a context. And you know how we do automatic writing, which is giving people a prompt and they have a certain amount of time to just write whatever comes to their mind. We follow a similar logic with automatic diagramming. So participants were given a limited number of kind of constraints or instructions. And here are some of the examples of the work that was created during the workshop. Just going to go through some of them. So here are some of the learnings from the experience. In terms of the methodology, we saw the emergence of certain patterns of representation. Just quickly go back. We had, like, for example, the idea of spirals and what spirals could mean for different purposes. And we saw these kind of patterns kind of emerging for different purposes. We also saw that moments like the experience of the pandemic was never kind of depicted as a linear experience. It was very multiple. It was the multiplicity of one moment, and space were very fluid. They were not fixed. And one of the most repeated comments from participants was, wow, I started in this way and never imagined that it was going to end up in this other way. Or I wanted to do this and suddenly this other thing started happening. So there was this idea of allowing and embracing visual emergence to happen and to kind of subvert the normative ways in which we understand time and space. In terms of the pandemic, we also learned a lot. We spoke about the tension between isolation and also the many community-led efforts that are happening all over the world, from gardening, farming, donation of clothes, etc. We also spoke about the idea of how the pandemic is making us reorient our thinking about the space. Bubbles were very common, and people were talking about how we created bubbles of acceptable contact during the pandemic, and also new emotional needs kind of arising from this experience. So these are just like selection of some learnings from this experience. What happened also is that we were both kind of diagnosing the present, the situation in which we are, but we were also sort of anticipating this so-called post-pandemic time in which, that's another topic, but thinking on what happens when restrictions are off and when we are able to move a little bit more freely. So from here, I moved to my third workshop, and at this point, I was thinking that this idea of territories was working for me and for asking the questions of participation and for trying methodologies. So the third workshop, I went ahead again with this idea of mapping, and this time I wanted to work with maps that are established, kind of real maps, not real, but not the mental cartographies I was just speaking about before. So what I started doing was to look at the materiality of maps and thinking how can I intervene them in order to tell a different story. So what we are going to be looking at are all experiments that I did, kind of some examples of how there is another story that can be told by using the surface of very well established maps or maps that are considered truth. These are just some examples. And I decided to work with one particular map. This map is dated 1507, the year 1507. And it's very famous because it is the map where the name America appears for the very first time. So many historians call it the birth certificate of America, which in itself is quite problematic because we know that America was populated by many people and had names, etc. But anyways, it's important because it has that American name. So I found this text I've been working on actually for many years by a Costa Rican historian. Her name is Vanessa Fonseca, and she does kind of a review of the different influences for this name to appear in the map. And she kind of argues that the name America is the name of a woman, and she goes into a construction of the concept of womanhood and femininity for the continent, for this island. So what I did for this workshop was to break this map in 6 parts. I converted it into postcards that were mailed to participants, all of them in the Dallas area. And this was my setup for this workshop. So the methodology for this one was a little different. I was guiding a dialogue. So the post-its, the yellow post-its that you see kind of at the center bottom, are conversation starters or sparklers that come from my research or from my thinking, but they were used kind of in a very random way throughout the workshop, and I wanted the emergence of a dialogue to occur. I also had other maps that are related to that map, and we all held a very deep conversation. A very deep conversation indeed. This is just a roadmap, if you wish, of the different topics that we touched upon. I'm not going to go into detail with that, but 2 things that were happening simultaneously that was very beautiful. One of them is that we were healing the legacy of colonization. All of us, as participants of the workshop, are native to this continent, and we are still very doubtful about the information we have about colonization, what was told to us in school, and what we learned about whoever came to the continent. And that left very, very strong repercussions in the formation of our own identity. So we had the space to talk about this kind of in a very relaxed environment, and started, I don't think arriving at answers, but at least like entering that space that needs to be healed. At the same time, everyone had the postcard, and everyone was kind of feeling this map and thinking through the map and intervening in it. So here are the interventions that participants made on the maps. Each one of them was taking a different takeaway from the workshop and kind of materializing it in different ways, with whichever materials they wanted to use. So what I did after that was to sit and stitch these pieces together. One of the main kind of topics that arose in the experience was the idea of repair, right? That something is not working well. And this is, like clear, here I'm kind of repairing the map, but we are repairing the histories and our own histories, not necessarily a history of the continent. So this was kind of an act of repairing the whole thing again and remap and create a new version of this historical map, but this time intervene with our ideas. We also spoke about how maps are these contradictory spaces that both put us in a space but take us away. But putting us, and like by defining us in a space, they are also taking away part of who we are. So we were working along in that contradiction. This is a picture of the whole map assembled into one piece. And I just thought that the back part was really interesting because it has like the traces of the whole experience, from the USPS people who handled these postcards to all the mess that happened when people were working on them until I kind of got them together and repaired them. And so just the last kind of manifestation of one way that I was thinking through these ideas was through a blog. It's called Laboratorio de Mundos, or Laboratory of Worlds. And it's a space where I was writing and I was thinking through this, and still kind of continues to be alive. So here are just 4 things that emerged from this project that were very unexpected to me in a way, but these were areas that I learned about. The first one is the idea of mediation. To speak about technology, we spoke about how mediation, or when technologies mediate, they not only facilitate a process, but they transform the process. And thinking about what technology could do that cannot be done otherwise is more interesting than just thinking on the boundaries of the technology itself. We spoke about, or we worked with these embodied reflective practices. For me, every workshop was an opportunity to dance before and after and to engage people in some sort of body movement, and to kind of leave the idea of complexity through these collective reflection processes was kind of very transforming. And the title of this thesis is Ecologies of Participation, because each workshop and each experience was complex. It had kind of a pedagogy, it has a way of being documented, it has all these material things I was doing throughout, and other things, and these became more of a methodology that I can kind of explore further now that I see that there is kind of a connecting thread amongst all of the components. And I created a bunch of temporary online communities. It was beautiful to see that I will invite people for a workshop that were participants for the previous workshop, and people were eager to be part of it again. And somehow the blog helped to close these communities temporarily in a way when I published kind of the conclusions of our encounters. And we created these spaces that I'm not too attached to, because that was the idea. That was the idea that they kind of emerge and they go. So this is my last slide, and I'm not talking about conclusions, but I'm talking about how this allow me to have a framework for my practice as I move forward. I definitely recognize the need of building communities and support among creative practitioners and holding conversations that are not productive. We are not talking about a project, but we are kind of asking questions that are going to impact our future projects for sure. The idea of territory became this very flexible lens that I want to kind of continue playing with in the future. And there are like a bunch of like research action pedagogies that I want to continue to develop. So one of them is the mental cartographies, but I see a lot of kind of opportunity on continuing to developing these as pedagogies. So that was it, and thank you very much for listening, and I'll go back to the call right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we've entered the public questioning section. So everyone is welcome to ask questions, but Catalina, you are the one who moderates this section, so I will let you do that. We have about 20 minutes for this section. You're muted, Catalina. You're muted, Catalina. You were muted.
Sorry. Oh yeah, Dr. Llamas has a question.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I think you did a really good job of integrating the different moments of where you were working through these concepts and drawing the connections between them, as well as the sort of the new thing that emerged in each one of these events. My first question for now is generally about, so you introduced to us your project as like thinking about the multiple meanings of participation, right? As not wanting to just think of participation as bringing participants in, right? But in these different workshops, exploring different facets of it. So I'm wondering if you could talk about those different facets or the different meanings. Like, how did working through these workshops, did participation become a more sort of robust understanding of what both your project was doing, but also how you were engaging with let's say the other people in this? I guess implicit in that is like, what are some strategies that you found or developed in these workshops to bring in participants? Like, how did the other people who helped you in this project become part of the project itself in a building of a different form of participation?
Okay. Okay. I'm not 100% sure I understood the question fully. I think it has different parts. Maybe I rephrase it and you let me know if that's correct what I understood. So I think there are two parts, if I'm not mistaken. I think the first one is that I was saying I wanted to open up this concept. So how did it open up, and what are some of the things that we kind of unpacked? I guess that's one thing. And the second thing is, I don't know if I'm understanding, but is it how that became part of the project itself? Like, how was I incorporating those for future experiences, or is it, I don't know, I'm not sure I understood this exactly.
No, I think you're right. So yes, the first part for sure is like, how were you unpacking or thinking differently of participation? And then given that, what were some like practical considerations given that unpacking of participation, right? Like, or was it just the unpacking of participation was purely at a theoretical level or conceptual level, just saying, well, participation can be all these things, but how did that then impact how you were handling further workshops given these unpacking?
Okay, thank you. Now I think I got it clear. So it's a lot. So I maybe just mention two things that come to me at this point in terms of when we unpack this idea of participation. One of them is that we recognize that each participatory encounter is an encounter of kind of power relations, and we often as designers hold the power of deciding over the space and to kind of have this notion of what is good or bad participation. So we question this expertise, saying like, where is it coming from, and why is it that we approach these spaces in this way, especially as we recognize that people already kind of manage their things. And I'm talking a lot about participatory processes that are not too ephemeral, that engage with communities and people over a certain time. So that was one of the things that kind of destabilized the idea of participation, of saying like, okay, so if we are not the experts here, so what is our role and how do we define it? So are we mediators? Are we facilitators? Are we guiding people? And we realized, so one of the things, coming to your second question, was to have clarity of that since the beginning. And as I said before, like build a vocabulary that is shared across the people that you are working with. So people know how to refer to you, but also how to refer to the process in general. And because we realize that by holding that authority, many times, many decisions don't move forward until I, as a facilitator, kind of say yes or no, basically. So the moment we start kind of changing the vocabulary, that's not only a rhetoric move, it also changes the dynamic. So I guess that's one that has a kind of a practical application. So how do we speak out our own processes when we are doing them? And what are the kind of the boundaries that we set for our role? And the second thing that you made me think of when you were, one second, let me think, it just escaped my brain, but it'll come back to me. So I remember what I wanted to say, but in general, we were much more attuned to the fact that not everyone is experiencing the same when they are going through the same experience. That we design something, but the fact that reflection processes are often not part, like participatory processes also fall into the logic of producing something at the end, like having some sort of outcome. And so that leaves aside questions of, okay, how are we doing in the middle? How is everyone feeling? What are some of the questions that you will have? And if we do not create those spaces, the questions are not going to arise because it's already like given as that space. So that was also something that gave us kind of a practical thing, or like of stopping and do not wait until the end to kind of do kind of a retrospective thing. So so those are two things. There may be more, but for now.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Llamas. I think Dr. Knight, you had a question.
Hi, thank you, Catalina, so much for your presentation. Congratulations on getting to this stage, and really enjoyed the presentation. I was really taken with your use of the word territory, and it, at the end you talked about how it sort of became a really flexible lens through which to view things. And I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about it, because it's a really distinctive word with it. Has connections to coloniality and issues of ownership and stewardship. And there are many ways to talk about people together in a space. So could you say more about it?
Yeah. Okay, I'm unmuted. It's funny that you asked this because there was a slide that I ended up hiding in the presentation that was kind of going a little into detail on what do I mean by a territory. I just let it out because it takes some time, but I'm so glad you asked it because I was actually working with a specific definition of territory that I found very rich. So a definition is that a territory is a shorthand for the system of relations whose continuous reenactment recreates a community. So it's a little complex, but all what it's trying to say is that it's a system where things are moving and flowing and changing rather than a fixed space delimited by whichever boundaries. This definition actually comes from a Colombian anthropologist, and he was working with indigenous communities who are given a budget from the government to create something called life plan, which is basically just like a future plan on how you're going to use some budget. But what they realized is that their definition of territory doesn't fit with this idea of having a definite life plan for the future and using that budget. But they were successful in convincing the government on doing something that changes over time. So I was very inspired by this notion, and that's when it became possible for me to think not only on my body as my territory, which actually was my starting point, but also my intellectual territory and my political territory. And what was beautiful is to recognize that I'm not alone in that space. Even in my own body, I'm not alone. But even my intellectual territory is shared by other people. And so if we share it, so why not coming together and unpack it and map it somehow? So that was part of the thinking about territories.
Thank you.
Sure.
If there's no other immediate question, I will ask mine. I'm going to quote you a couple of times here. And what I really want you to do is sort of just respond to this cluster of ideas. There were a couple of different questions. I kind of put them together. So you said you wanted the process to be messy and complex. So think about that. I want to know why more, but I'm going to add a couple of things that you said. You said something to the effect right after that you weren't doing theory or something to that effect, and that you wanted to allow the process to show you a way forward. You also used the phrase experiments that manifest concepts, right? I think all these to me are a cluster of ideas, and then which also you connected this to you mentioned Deleuze's mapping disorientation. So if you could talk about this messy and complexity as it relates to your process, I'd like to hear that.
Yeah, so that's part of my learning from you, Dinterri. But it's also, like at a very personal level, I felt like I was setting myself up for something different than what I was used to do before, as a person that always kind of tries to control the process. So first, it was a very intentional way of seeing what else can I do that breaks away from the canon of what I knew before. Not necessarily because it was bad, but just because trying new things is always positive. And I guess part of what I did in ATEC, in my journey in ATEC, was like trying different things here or there, and then realizing that each one of them is very valuable, and they are not necessarily, we had this conversation before, they are not always kind of departing from a strong theoretical point and then you move into action. It's also valid and it's enjoyable to also start from intuition. And so that was kind of what I set up for myself as a way of experimenting what I could do, and if I could manage, because honestly, my proposal for this project was very, as you were saying, I was like, this is going to be messy, this is going to be complex, and obviously the question is like, so what is it? And I'm like, I don't know, because it's going to be messy and it's going to be complex. So there was a lot of uncertainty, and I think part of what I kind of love about the project is to see myself kind of at the end saying like, I just let it happen, and I could manage that uncertainty. So one of something that I think helped me mentally was not to think on the workshops as like this big project that I have to put together. I also let go of the need to control many of the variables in the workshop, and I allow it to just happen without kind of overdoing the theoretical framework or overdoing like the methodology. Actually, a second workshop, I did it twice because I got like a lot of participants. So that all of those were kind of opportunities to try. And then I became good at documenting this messiness because I just let it happen. But then I was like, I need to record this. I need to somehow. So that's why I had the blog. I had my diaries. I had audio recordings of all the workshops. And then the process was sitting and just going through all of this just to make a narrative out of this that is legible to others. But that was kind of the intention, and that was the experience. Obviously, there is some sort of a structure at this point. Otherwise, the presentation wouldn't be possible. But in terms of how I feel and how my feeling throughout this year it was a lot about going for a walk and just allowing these ideas to kind of come to me. And that's kind of a big learning for me.
Thank you. And so, you got more uncomfortable with uncertainty, which is really good. That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think you have another question here.
Oh, yeah. How do I know that? Oh, yeah. Heidi, Dr. Cooley.
So what I think is really interesting is the work of collaboration and the work of intellectual generosity. And I was hoping you could speak to how those two modes of scholarship and practice are important to you and how you've learned about that work through the process.
Okay, I'm going to try the best to also understand the question. Something's going on with me today. I guess you said two keywords, which is collaboration and intellectual generosity, and how that is part of like my scholarship and practice. Is it like the right question? Heidi, sorry.
Yes, I was just hoping that you would. We've been in conversation for several years now, and this is something I know about you, that you came here really interested in kind of building out communities of practice. So I'm wanting you to talk more about what you've accomplished, what you've learned, what you have more to say. Whether it's theoretically or not doesn't matter to me, but what it is about collaboration and intellectual generosity that you've gained, that you have something more to say, that you're going to bring out into when you move out into the world. What are you going to, when you are working with people more? I would like to hear more about that kind of work, because that's, I think, the work. Right, that's part of the work. Mm-hmm. That is the art and the practice, right? Like it is an ethos. So that's what I would like you to talk to.
Thanks, Heidi, for clarifying. Okay, now I get it. So I think there are several things I'm thinking on, but there is one that I was previously to this project. I was kind of afraid to go into a space where you propose a project and you are not asking people to kind of, as I said before, like move forward and have an objective, but to unpack our practice. I always felt the need. And honestly, this is funny because I recognize that I had that need after going through this experience. I had the need of engaging with participants and questioning our practice, because I'm very critical of the discipline of design, but I also can end up isolated in that critique if I'm not kind of opening a space for discussions. And the moments that I have to kind of engage with practitioners of this is like during a conference that happens every year or whatever. But one of the things that I gain from the idea of building these communities of practice is that there is always the opportunity to open up our intentions as persons and leave the pretentious objectives of projects aside for some time. But that's a very vulnerable process for people. So that's why it requires kind of thinking about the pedagogy and the way of holding those dialogues. And that's what I tried to do several times during the workshops, and that's what I think I can be good at in terms of facilitating discussions that are obviously not blaming anyone for doing one. There is no right or wrong in participation, I think, but there are definitely things that we can improve and we can be more aware of. So I think that's one of my learnings, that I'm not afraid anymore of holding these conversations, even who knows, in an academic space, but hopefully in the professional space it is possible. And I think another thing from that is that kind of the flexibility that I gained with the previous question, with the idea of territories. I found that many people can connect to that if it's framed in a way that is interesting for others. And it provides us, like, if we think about like a territory as Dallas, some of us are in Dallas currently, that's already a territory that we share. And the moment you start kind of thinking on which other territories we occupy, we will always find overlapping experiences. So I think that that's one of the frameworks of practice that, and it has been widely worked from philosophy, actually. So that's kind of for me, is like, how do I take all this rich understanding of territories from, especially I was reading philosophy for some time, into pedagogies, into practices, to kind of think on them more critically. So it's kind of related to the previous point about kind of these reflection processes. But these are things I'm definitely taking forward, and I'm not afraid of the fact that they are not the most productive, but I do believe that they are important, and that I can hopefully put them in practice with our communities in the future.
I do love that you raised the word pedagogy, right? Like, that's huge. Like, that I think is super important to thinking about participation and practice and collaboration and intellectual generosity. I think pedagogy it's key to that. So thank you, Catalina. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Pulley.
All right, thank you everyone for your questions. That is the end of the question and answer section. We have to move on to the next section. So thank you all for coming to this presentation and participating. And we're going to ask you to kindly all leave now so we can do the business of the committee, including you, Catalina. Thank you very much. Everyone give her a hand and say thank you, or however we want to do that. There we go. Thank you. Okay. We'll see you all soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Catalina, we'll see you in about 10 minutes or so.
Sure.